He followed his father into a career in printing, which might seem somewhat unremarkable to a lot of people, but that led him to some really amazing mentoring in his early years. Can you talk about that a little?
He had such a love for his father. His father had such a capacity to make a difference in people's lives that printing was a means to an end for their family, that he had a solid job throughout the Depression when other people didn't. So while you might say that printing was not the most illustrious vocation, it certainly solved a lot of problems in the Monson household because his father worked, he was able to work, his brother was able to work. One time he said to his father, who had hired a man who was less able to do a lot of work, had some severe disabilities, and Tommy kind of couldn't understand why his dad had hired him. And so he asked his dad, "Why did you hire him? He can't do that." And his father looked at him and he said, "Because he needed a job." Well, you begin to see that printing gave him an opportunity to help other people in their lives. When he was the manager at Deseret Press, he got very close to the men who ran the machines. He got very close to the men who set the type, one letter at a time. He got very close to all of the people that were in that environment with him, and he respected what they did. And because of that, they were dear friends. And he spoke at all their funerals. He went to family events that were significant. They were part of the Thomas Monson family, which grew bigger and bigger the more he had opportunity to serve in larger and larger venues.
In addition to those experiences, he seems to have, it led him on a path where he worked with some remarkable church leaders in capacities that most people wouldn't have, it seems to me.
I think his first really significant exposure to church leaders was with J. Reuben Clark. President Clark was wanting to write a book called eventually Our Lord of the Gospels, and he invited Tom Monson, who was in charge of the church press, to come up to his office, and he asked him to help him. And so one afternoon a week, Tom Monson would go up to Elder Clark's office, and they would sit and they would talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And President Clark pulled out stacks of yellow notepads where he had written his thoughts and his references and everything that he was coming up with for this book. And essentially, he and Tom Monson worked through this material and created this book, which was a remarkable book. But in the process, the training and the experience that Tom Monson received of being tutored by a prophet of God, he was then in the first presidency, of becoming a dear friend to him, to the extent that if he wanted to go out to his ranch in Twilla, he'd take Tom Monson with him. That opened a door that I think the Lord intended for him to have a fast track into having a grasp of the gospel and a grasp of the ministry of Jesus Christ and an understanding of how the brethren worked. And so he had that opportunity, and then he worked very closely with Mark E. Peterson, who was also an apostle, who was over the Deseret News. And he had an opportunity to, because they printed it, he had an opportunity to get close to him and, again, to see how he worked and how he thought and how he made judgment calls. He had an opportunity to work with President McKay because President McKay did books, and he printed those books for him. And so he'd have President McKay down at the printing office, and he'd be up at the office with President McKay going through the galleys and going through the material. But it was all just a means, I think, to giving Tom Monson a relationship that created trust and a bond and an understanding far beyond his years yet in church service. He had Harold B. Lee, who'd been his stake president. He was close to many of the brethren who wrote books. So he had a lot of mentors.